Right, okay. Hello everybody. This is my presentation on New Labour, the rise and fall of. Basically how this is going to work is, first I'm going to talk about New Labour at the start, how it came about, why it came about, so the rise in other words, and then I'm going to talk about its sort of period in power, so through 1997 to 2010, and then afterwards have a little bit of a just small Q&A, just in case anyone has any questions or wants to express their own views. Anyway, so we're going to, so just to start, so what is New Labour, essentially? So it's a political movement that arose in the early 1990s and late 1980s, actually. What it stands for, in principle, at least, is not much, because it's a very pragmatic sort of ideology. But the main things it has, its main two sort of spheres are economic prosperity and social justice, and you come to hear this a lot with Labour rhetoric, especially with John Prescott. So economic prosperity, so what this means is an advocation of a free market economy, a belief in deregulation, a strong belief in globalisation as it increases, well, it's good for business basically, among other things, and very good for international relations. And finally, an abandonment of the desire to seek equality of outcome, meaning the idea that people should be equal wages and things like that, so at the end, so in terms of standards of living, etc. In favour of the idea of equality of opportunity, so everyone having equal rights and equal opportunity to progress as they will, but obviously some people, through competition, end up at the top, essentially. As for social justice, there's a strong desire to introduce sort of reform and massive investment, especially in the health and education public services, and to an extent privatised services, because they believe these are the foundations of equal opportunity. People have to have education to progress in the world, and health. There's a strong belief in the Labour Party that health shouldn't be decided on your how much money you have, which I think is fair enough. Anyway, they also believe in rights-based egalitarianism, so this is basically what I was saying before, equal rights. Don't confuse it with the more right-wing strain if you do study politics, but I don't think most of you do, but it's fine. And also there's humanitarian interventionism. Now this comes to sort of Blair's international approach to things, so we'll come to that with the Iraq War and Kosovo and things like that later. Next slide. So this is just a sort of quick timeline of the Labour Party since Howard Wilson. There are reasons why I didn't include Clement Attlee, by the way, if you can ask me that later. And things like that. So obviously we have the Red Labour years. Now this is Old Labour still. This is the foundations of the Old Labour movement, which is all about equality of outcome and about sort of very socialist principles. We then move on to the transition years, which I'll discuss a little in detail as well, with Neil Kinnock. And then halfway through this period, and this is very debatable because I'm sure some people would say John Smith isn't New Labour, but we have the transition to a more right-wing New Labour approach with John Smith in 1992 to 94. Then we have the New Labour years, 94 to 2007, Tony Blair, and then Gordon Brown, and then we have the Blue Labour years, and that is Ed Miliband, with his return to try and encompass more sort of working class votes, basically. But I won't be talking much about him. You can ask me about him afterwards if you like. So the first part we have is Red Labour. So we have Howard Wilson. He believed in strong progressive taxation. I think at one point, this is often cited, he had income taxation at the top end of around 85 to 90% of your income. So very extreme and quite heavily socialist. Then we have James Callaghan, or Jim, or Sonny Jim, as he's fondly remembered in the Labour Party. He only was in power for about 2 or 3 years as Prime Minister, but he oversaw the winter of discontent, which led to extreme disenfranchisement with the Labour Party and unpopularity after, essentially, there was massive strikes in the winter of, I really should know, 1978 or 1979, and basically this resulted in huge anger. Like people in the south especially were very angry because they couldn't have electricity 24 hours a day or that kind of thing. And then finally we have Michael Foot, Now, Michael Foot was presiding over the 1983 Labour Manifesto pledge, which was dubbed by contemporaries as the longest suicide note in history. This essentially came from extreme left-wing principles. So, unilateral nuclear disarmament, which doesn't sound too bad. Nationalisation of virtually every single industry possible, really, just to put it in layman's terms. And also, this was upset in abolition of the House of Lords and withdrawing from the European Economic Commission, I think it's called, which is essentially what the Euro was, the EU was then. So moving on, we then had the transition years. So we have Neil Kinnock there and John Smith. Neil Kinnock attempted to modernise the Labour Party. This was in 1983 to 1992. And this basically was moving it to the right, trying to stifle old voices like Tony Benn, who passed away very recently, unfortunately. And it also saw Labour slowly, with each election, gathering bigger portions of the vote than before. And then we had John Smith. He is a very interesting character, strong parliamentarian, believed to have, I would describe myself as a practical socialist. That's not a denigration of anyone who is more left-wing than that. But as well as, and he sort of had a very much more right-wing principles in terms of his budget. For example, Ken Livingstone blamed for the defeat of the 1992 general election, but Tony Blair, who was in similar debates with him at the time, said it was just because we hadn't come quite as far as we could have. Unfortunately, John Smith passed away in 1994, suddenly to a heart attack, and this led to 1994, the power struggle. Now, this had there were three main sort of power figures, just to try and streamline it a bit. There were three main people: Tony Blair, Peter Mandelson, and Gordon Brown. Now, Peter Mandelson wasn't really going to be tapped for the next leadership election. He just wasn't popular enough, to be honest. But he had huge influence in the Labour Party. Now, he was very good friends with both Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, but he decided to back Tony Blair as he believed he was a better communicator and speaker, which personally I'd agree with. And this left Gordon Brown, who really hating Peter Mandelson, even though they were meant to be allies in the cabinet, for quite a long time. There was strict, and this actually comes up later when Gordon Brown essentially backstabs him and kicks him out of office. Once Tony Blair was in power from 1994, I'm sure, we were all alive by now, we had the 1997 general election. This is a quote from Tony Blair at the time when they just won. "A new dawn has broken, has it not?" Now, just to clarify what this meant to the Labour Party, we had 18 years of horrible opposition, which was really just awful. And not, I don't want to get too partisan about it, but and it was just such a good thing that we had one of the biggest landslide elections in 1997 of British history. It was the euphoria at the time. I can't even communicate to you how happy people were, especially even some in the Conservative Party. It saw a massive swing in Labour's favour and against the Tories. It also happened to see the largest amount of female MPs elected at the time. Most of them were in the Labour Party. Just to put it out there. And it also led to the longest spell of Conservative opposition since the 1760s, when they weren't Conservatives, they were under a different name. But it was just trying to communicate how big this election was in terms of left-wing trying over right-wing, essentially. So Tony Blair. So the main policies that he put in 1997 after he was elected, he decided to continue the construction of the Millennium Dome. He privatised the Bank of England, so they now have, and I'm sure you remember there's quite a lot of controversy at the moment because of this, they have sole control over interest rates, and at the moment they're keeping them very low, which is to the anger of lots of bankers, basically, a lot among them. Also, he managed to secure the Good Friday Agreement, I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but this was essentially... as well as that, there was also a few protests. We don't need to worry too much about those. But the fuel duty protests in particular, where lorries which had to deliver fuel and oil, basically just stopped delivering it and blocked the runways, and the country came to a complete standstill for a few weeks. And this was nearly, Tony Blair actually was almost toppled from power at the time, but fortunately the strikes gave in. So, as well as that, we had the Kosovo affair. So I'm going to talk a little about international affairs. I don't want to go too into detail because it's focused on far too much during Tony Blair's premiership. But basically, in early 1999, Slobodan Milosevic, he enacted a policy of ethnic cleansing. This was essentially, it was a brutal sort of regime involving the mass deportation and, in some cases, sort of persecution of Muslims in the area. So basically, after visiting a refugee camp, Blair was one of the main candidates for pushing the sort of military involvement into this area because he was a devout Christian. This was his reasoning, by the way. He was a devout Christian. He had strong beliefs about not allowing dictators to do this kind of horrible atrocities to people, essentially. And basically, he was the main person pushing this forward because most people, other people, like Bill Clinton, for example, the President of the United States, wanted some military intervention, so bombing and things, but not ground invasion, which was the main thing that Tony Blair pushed at the time, which came a lot more problem later on as well. So after much lobbying and persuading, where he essentially put his reputation on the line here, it's difficult to stress how difficult this was for him, but he managed to convince Bill Clinton in the United States to go along with his doctrine of humanitarian interventionism, which is intervening in other countries for humanitarian motives, essentially, so helping people, basically. And as soon as the invasion was finally put on the floor of the UN, Boris Yeltsin basically just said to Milosevic, you're going to go down, you're going to die if you don't, well, not die, but and basically Milosevic capitulated instantly. So that was a very big success for Tony Blair. He was considered a hero, and you have to remember he saved essentially hundreds of thousands of people's lives potentially. This was he really did do a great thing for the for people here. Next one. Now we have Tony Blair in 2001 to 2005. That's Charles Clarke, by the way. I'm sure teachers won't be too big fans of him. But he introduced the controversial top-up fees policy. Now this was the first time that tuition fees basically were put in for universities. So it was at £3,000 maximum a year, and it was very controversial because they were free before, and it wasn't a Labour thing to do to make people have to pay for education essentially. So people didn't like it at all, which is very understandable. As well as this, however, people often forget that there were massive investments in health and education, record low waiting times here, and massive surges in academic success, which were obviously a very good thing, I'm sure we'll all agree. At the same time as well, however, we had the war on terrorism. So, I'm going to try and go over this quite quickly, because as I said, I don't like to focus on it too much. But, so essentially, Blair was closely aligned himself after the 9/11 attacks with Bush and America because he felt great sympathy for the cause of the American people, and also he had already spoken several times against Saddam Hussein, who had, or was believed to have, close links with Al-Qaeda at the time, which was the believed group who initiated 9/11 under Osama bin Laden. As a result of this, he pushed Blair, he had 54 meetings over the world with international leaders in a few weeks, and I mean that's quite a big, I was expected to be on a plane for about 5 minutes, so I mean it's quite a big deal that he was on it for such a long time, basically just trying to get intervention in different countries in Afghanistan to try and find Osama bin Laden. So he whipped up support with the international community and managed to push a UN resolution to basically invade Afghanistan in 2001 and find Osama bin Laden. Now, this didn't leave the issue unfinished, though, according to Tony Blair. So, on the 6th of April, and it's important we stress this little point here because it becomes very prominent. Tony Blair and George Bush, the new President of the United States, had a meeting at George Bush's ranch in Texas. So agreement was made, which may have been not entirely disclosed to the public, which supported America, which said that Blair and Britain would support America in a war against Iraq only if George Bush sought UN resolutions and sought through the legislation in the UN first. Coincidentally, a dossier was produced soon after on the amount of WMDs and which means weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And there is a little controversy as to the way it was presented, perhaps maybe in a slightly deceptive way to incentivise the war in Iraq, but you know, that's debatable. However, George Bush was still unwilling to go through UN resolutions to try and get to Saddam Hussein, essentially, because at the time Saddam Hussein was committing basically large amounts of atrocities that it was genuinely believed by a lot of people, we have to stress this, that he was actually trying to develop weapons of mass destruction. So, this is where Tony Blair found himself in 2003, early 2003. That isn't looking very happy. The United Nations did eventually impose extreme sanctions on Saddam Hussein. However, Saddam Hussein didn't really keep. He just ignored a lot of the sanctions made. These are economic and military, and some of them he just didn't comply with to the extent to which UN demanded. Now, the problem here was that George Bush still wanted to invade Iraq, but obviously this wouldn't be legal as he didn't have United Nations approval. Whereas Tony Blair had already promised George Bush that he would help, he would send Britain in with America if this occurred, if he'd already sought UN legislation and solutions, which George Bush seemed to think he had. So basically he was faced with the problem of defying America and George Bush, as in breaking the agreement they made, or entering an illegal war into Iraq. Now, I'm sure you all know what happened and which option he chose. So he ended up with the Iraq War, which was passed or legislated in Britain in 2003 when the Conservatives supported the Labour push for a war, despite massive Labour rebellion in the back. It was only because of the Conservatives that we managed to pass this. I'm not trying to put the blame on the Conservatives, but it was only because of the Conservatives that we did manage to push this legislation through for the war. This obviously led to a rather catastrophic war. There are various reasons for this, which you can debate with me in the Q&A afterwards. And I will tell you my opinion, but we did, as Britain, want to try and create a better Iraq at the time. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough control over the military operations in Iraq because America were, in complete honesty, the bigger partner in this whole situation. And a quote from Donald Rumsfeld, who was the US commander, when we asked him to bring in a police force, an Iraq-run police force, was, "We don't do nation building." A lot of the fault does rest on America, and in all seriousness, that's not even a biased opinion, that's just a fact. Anyway, moving on from the Iraq War, at last. So between 2005 and 2007, now, after he was re-elected on a much slimmer majority in 2005, relations between Gordon Brown and Tony Blair broke down massively. Because basically Tony Blair, before he was elected leader of the Labour Party, made an agreement with Brown to essentially step down after one or two, the actual time is still, no one actually really knows, but one or two elections, and basically Tony Blair didn't. So Gordon Brown was naturally not very happy with this. And this led to I'll just continue to say, Blair, however, at the same time, in between his third premiership, he worked with the International Olympic Committee and basically was one of the main reasons we managed to get 2012 London going. I mean, this is a quote. He was simply stunning. He was a very important part of it, and he really was. It is possible we wouldn't have had it without him, because France were also making a big bid at the time. But, you know, I mean, who wants to do power something, I suppose. But we also, at the time, we had the cash for peerages scandal. Now, this was really the moment where Tony Blair was basically starting to think about when he was going to have to leave, because, frankly, to sum it up, a lot of big Labour donators to the party happened to be getting, you know, advantageous policies put through, and at the same time becoming lords. But you know, weird coincidence. But anyway, this all led into a climax where essentially Brown, I'm not going to go into too much detail because it's very complicated, but managed to set up a coup against Tony Blair, in which he said, "We're going to do a Margaret Thatcher on you," basically. This basically forced Blair out of premiership, and he had to resign on the 27th of June 2007. Now, I'm sure all of you know who this is because we were old enough to genuinely know what was going on then. Anyway, basically, Gordon Brown. Not many people do know this. Came in with a wave of popularity in 2007, and for the first few months of his premiership, he was dominating the opinion polls, which seems quite strange to think about when you look at him and the way he was treated by the media in 2010. But he was very popular. However, and he was also very popular because of the fact that he dealt very calmly and well with the floods in northern England at the time in 2007, and with various terrorist attacks that were occurring. However, the reason that he became very unpopular was there was a lot of speculation at the time after Gordon Brown came in as whether there was going to be a re-election, because he was a new leader, and of course he was a new Prime Minister, and theoretically he wasn't really democratically elected. But basically, he didn't shut down these sort of speculations and rumours, and then one fine the media basically said the question after a couple of weeks, "Are you going to hold a re-election?" At the same time, the opinion polls had just taken a downturn for Gordon Brown, and he did say, "No, I'm not going to," and that sort of discredited him a lot, because people thought there's just been a downturn in opinion polls, and now you're saying we're not going to have an election. As well as this, the other main discrediting feature to Gordon Brown was the global recession. Just going to point it out, the global recession, which obviously caused a massive economic crisis in Britain, which we're still feeling the effects of today as we slowly climb out of recovery from a bad conservative policy. But anyway, obviously Gordon Brown didn't win the election in 2010, and we ended up with a coalition. And this is sort of where New Labour sort of ended, and Ed Miliband came in with his much more left-wing principles and himself as well. But anyway, so the good things, and this is just my personal opinion now, because obviously I've had a very impartial presentation so far. So the good things in terms of the legacy of New Labour were the longest, and this is, so the longest period of low inflation, high economic growth in British history, the 2012 Olympics, a peaceful island, a strong position in the EU without having the euro, because Gordon Brown was personally responsible for the reason why we don't have the euro right now, and also record levels of public investment in health and education. Now the bad things, which I'm going to hear a lot more of afterwards, are the Iraq War, obviously, which went very badly, a poor economic situation, just read that bit there as well, but, and also the loss of 60% of Britain's gold reserves as well, through a sale which was at a downturn, and again I will take questions on that if anyone has any. And finally, the death of old Labour and the embracement of capitalism, which again I'll take questions on afterwards, but it was basically necessary that old Labour, with its principles that were causing the longest suicide note in history, had to lay down and die basically for the greater good. Anyway, So yeah, any questions? Hopefully that wasn't too boring. Thank you very much. Just so you know, by the way, these are our prominent figures in the Labour Party. We've got the New Labour here, so Alistair Campbell, Peter Mandelson and Charles Clarke, and then not all old Labour, but basically people who weren't happy with New Labour. So Chris Mullen, George Galloway, who we've got coming in soon, thanks to that spot shortly, and Claire Short and Robin Cook. But anyway, any questions? Daniel.
What's the difference between conservative ideology and the
Well, I'm glad you asked. New Labour, basically, one of the main differences is they have similar economic policies, but for different ends. So New Labour still believed in strong investment in education and health, whereas Conservatives are putting in policies that cut it severely right now. As well as that, New Labour they have a much more they had a humanitarian interventionist approach to foreign policy, which was much more involved in basically going into other countries than the Conservatives were. To an extent, I mean, with the whole Syrian thing, it's still in debate. But obviously, I would personally say David Cameron was actually very reluctant, really, to do too much in terms of intervening in Syria overall. He didn't really push forward the case that much, and thankfully, it was the EU, not David Cameron, who was pushing forward the whole policy of intervening in Syria. Yes.
I'm going to pick up on the point you made in your presentation. You said there was widespread support for going into Iraq. Yeah, if my memory fails me, maybe there were 1 million people marching in London in opposition to the Iraq war.
Is that your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Why do you say there was widespread support? I'm just curious to know the difference.
Okay. Sure. I'm not entirely sure I said there was widespread support. Obviously, a lot of people did genuinely believe it was the right thing to do. I mean, it's difficult because I haven't brought statistics with me, but a lot of people did genuinely. You're right, some people, and in fact, a very large portion of the country was very opposed to the Iraq War, but overall it did pass in the House of Commons, and that was the main place where I was referring to wide support, because overall, despite a Labour backbench rebellion, it did pass in favour. Alas.
Firstly, what's top-up fees got to do with equality of opportunity?
Well, the reason for top-up fees wasn't to do with equality of opportunity. It was to do with the fact that basically it was partly a money-making thing, and it was basically just an economic sort of policy. It wasn't to do with the idea that people should have an equal right to education, which was in a way very different to New Labour's policy before. And personally, I'd say that was one of the worst parts of New Labour. I wouldn't have done it myself, although I don't know the economic situation in as much detail as Charles Clarke. Go on.
It's interesting you didn't mention the whole Bernie Ecclestone thing, where
I did hint at it. Go on.
you hinted it, but it was something which I think should have been said if you were going to talk about New Labour, in which the story, I just want to know your comments, I'm not just a preacher or anything, but the story was that he, after having meetings with Tony Blair, he's obviously in the F1 business, certain legislation was passed which was in his favour, and after large exception to donations from him. This whole idea of social justice and all that kind of thing, when does that fit in there? The idea of accepting massive donations in return for legislation from high-ranking celebrities?
Okay. Well, firstly, that wasn't actually in favour of. By coincidence, it did go in favour of Ecclestone, of course. But although there was a large donation, it wasn't. There was no deal made out, essentially. There was no deal made out of, if you make this donation, we are going to put in this policy, though. And essentially, the reason why it was, as I did mention earlier, it fits in with the New Labour principle of deregulation. And what Abbas was referring to specifically was a policy where you couldn't advertise, I think it was smoking, except with alcohol, except in basically driving adverts or Formula One adverts, basically. So that it wasn't quite as specific as that, but there was no deal made, just so everybody knows. And so I would say it still does fit in the New Labour principle.
We might have to.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. Wait. What we have to Okay. Right. Anyway, Ali.
You talked about Labour and sort of one of the good things, one good part of their legacy was sort of the high growth that they experienced. But if you attribute the recession as you say it's global, so it essentially isn't that much of Labour's fault. The boom was also very global and almost pretty much led to the recession. So would you really say that that's a good thing?
Well, one of the main reasons we felt that that global boom so significantly was because of Labour's strong international market policy and the fact that we became much more globalised than prior. Before New Labour, we were a very US-sceptic country, and then Tony Blair came in with very pro-EU policies, which allowed us to feel the benefit of that boom. So it wasn't just, it was genuinely, like, we felt it because of New Labour. And as well as that, it was still, I mean, it happened because of a fall in US housing markets originally, which I don't see how you can blame that on Tony Blair. So, personally, I would say that you can't attribute that decline to Tony Blair or New Labour. Roy Cuddy.
I'd just like to know your opinions then on Brown's management of the 2008 financial crisis and an argument brought by Conservative nowadays.
Was that
An argument commonly brought up by the Conservative.
Okay. Obviously, what he did was he nationalised Northern Rock. He brought in basically he brought in economic policies which hurt Britain very hard overall, but it actually did help the international economic situation massively. If Northern Rock had declined and fallen and collapsed, then that would have had a much worse effect than if it had been saved as it was by Gordon Brown. And a lot of the time Conservatives make fun of Gordon Brown, or, because he slipped once and said we saved the world. But in a lot of ways that is genuinely true in terms of he actually made very big, basically he nationalised things which were very detrimental to Britain, but hugely helped the global economy.
You talked about the Iraq War, but you didn't really talk much about the aftermath and the resignation of Blair's cabinet ministers and like the legislations that came about to like counter terror. What do you feel about Blair's response and how it kind of took away most of our civil liberties?
Okay. Well, with his whole anti-terrorism legislation acts, which almost led to us having identity cards, as quite a liberal thing for myself, I would say there was something very wrong with that, and that shouldn't have been put in place. And that is something where I would happily say this was wrong from David. However, you do have to bear in mind the climate at the time and the fact that there was massive paranoia nationally, and it did actually lead to a lot of arrests of people who were then found to be, well, not too many people actually, but who were found to be engaged in terrorist acts. But yes, you're right, it wasn't a good part of New Labour, and I will accept that. Richard, sorry.
There was a big increase in immigration in
absolutely.
the 1990s and 2000s during New Labour. I'm interested to know what their policies were about it.
Okay. All right. So basically, we had very laissez-faire attitude to immigration. Basically, we didn't have a problem with it. We thought it was very beneficial to the economy, which it is because it provides low-paid jobs, which then boosts businesses. But as well as that, so that was our main policy. We basically allowed them to all come in, basically, which certainly did lead to a slightly undesirable situation, which some people believe, some people believe is very undesirable, which has led to the rise of UKIP in a lot of ways, with consequences policies. But at the same time, it really does help business so much. It is such an economically beneficial policy that I would still think it's a good thing. Right.
To what extent do you think Blair's religious beliefs influence?
Okay. Yeah, well, massively. His whole humanitarian interventionist approach to international politics was entirely, in my opinion, because of his religious beliefs. He was a strong devout Christian, and he always said, when it came to the Iraq War, that he believed as a Christian, and this isn't an insult to Christians, that it was the right thing to do, basically. Yeah, it really was probably the main guide of his policy there, although not so much domestically, because he did come up with some very quite authoritarian things which have already been mentioned in the anti-terrorism legislation.
Why do you think the kind of New Labour ideology has been abandoned by Ed Miliband? No, sorry, Ed Miliband. And what do you think? Or what do you think about Labour Party moving towards the left?
Okay. Well, I was hoping someone would ask me this. So basically, I think one of the main reasons was because there was a massive loss of faith in New Labour after the 2010 election, where thankfully the huge defeat we had, as in we lost so many seats compared to 2005, was very discrediting. And so, and also we had a much bigger sort of working class general attitude against immigration at the time, which then brought Miliband to say, basically we're losing a lot of our working class votes because of our shift to the centre and our favouring of middle classes. So we're going to have to bring in more left-wing policies to basically win back those votes. It wasn't quite as pragmatist as that, because I think Ed Miliband also just generally, as a person, believes in a more left-wing principled approach to politics. I mean, he really does seem to hate big businesses, for example, with his whole freeze on energy prices and things like that. But it basically would win more votes, and that's just what Ed Miliband was, and what the party really wanted at the time, because they were a bit sick of New Labour. Sorry?
What do you think?
What, Ed Miliband?
Of like the party was
I think it was very good at restoring our integrity as a party, because people, when they talk about Ed Miliband, you never hear someone say, yeah, but he's a big liar, to be honest, because he really does believe what he says. You can tell by the way he talks. Some people do call him an idiot, but no one calls him a big liar. My personal opinion on the fact that it's left would be, overall, it isn't a good idea, because centralist politics are much more popular, and my personal political beliefs are much more centralist than Ed Miliband's. But it certainly does seem to be working in terms of making us look like the nice guys compared to the Conservatives right now, basically. Yes?
Given that you claim that Labour was very humanitarian and that there was a revolt within the House of Commons for invading Iraq, how much do you think that the Iraqi war was less about humanitarian needs and more about economic needs for you?
Yeah, okay. Tony Blair had criticised and strongly condemned Saddam Hussein since 1998, far before a war was ever even conceptualised or perceived, because we didn't have the 9/11 attacks and none of the motivation, we wouldn't have been able to do it in 1998. I think Tony Blair genuinely thought that, and he was, Saddam Hussein was a despot and an evil man. He is responsible for the death of at least hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million people, because of his persecution of Kurdish people as well. But obviously, I think that the oil incentive was much more to do with America as opposed to Britain. George Bush certainly seemed very keen on seizing all of the oil industry as soon as they got in, which led to him basically saying, we don't care about rebuilding Iraq and why we have such a poor situation right now. But I wouldn't pin that on Tony Blair. I think he always criticised Saddam Hussein, whereas with George Bush it was a much more opportunist approach for the economic reasons of saying.
Do you think that the decision to go into Iraq was driven by global misunderstanding to do with the situation regarding Saddam Hussein and his relation to terrorism, or do you think it was driven by Tony Blair's and George Bush's hot-headedness?
I think it was mostly driven by their hot-headedness, actually. Yeah, definitely. It was there was strong misunderstanding as well. That has to be said. And I think at the time, Tony Blair did genuinely believe, along with the Labour Party, that there were weapons of mass destruction with it. Although I don't say the whole of the Labour Party, because obviously some people rebelled solely because of it. But I think there was a very and taking of that oil-based attitude, especially from George Bush, maybe a little from Tony Blair, but his hot-headedness more came from his very strong Christian beliefs again. I think he really did feel that it was the right thing to do, which made him very irrational in the way that he assessed the Iraq situation. Yes?
Do you think it's right that a Prime Minister should be able to cite religious reasons for such a large policy? A policy that has so much effect?
Well, he didn't. Obviously, I would say there's more like moral reason in itself, because you don't have to be religious to think that what Saddam Hussein was doing was wrong and awful and horrific and should have been stopped. So I wouldn't say it was so much religious reasons, and I think there was nothing wrong with citing moral reasons. Of course, he did say, I'm a Christian a couple of times, this is why I'm doing it, but he could have easily have been secular and said, this is the morally right thing to do as well. Jeremy?
What are Ed Miliband's beliefs about our relationship with America, and what are your personal political views about what should our relationship be?
Okay, well, Ed Miliband has a much more sceptic approach to America, and basically he believes that we should try and be a bit more left-wing. He doesn't believe in that kind of libertarianism. He believes in a much more cautious approach to America, and this also comes from the fact that a lot of distrust was caused by the relationship between Bush and Blair, with the whole Yo Blair thing, where it was very embarrassing. My personal belief is economically it's very advantageous. We make a lot of money from our financial alliance with New York and London. But I mean, I guess at the same time, maybe it isn't the best manoeuvre right now in terms of public opinion. We'll have one more question from. Okay, we'll have two more questions from Abbas and Ali. So Abbas and Ali's on.
You talked about George Bush and saying that he was the one that pushed the way that they entered into Iraq and stuff. But if Tony Blair didn't cry out and say this is completely wrong, this is not what we signed up for, then isn't he just as culpable as George Bush?
Well, even if he'd done that, that wouldn't have made any difference at all. He couldn't have just instantly pulled out again, because frankly that would have just, our relationship with America would have just been instantly just destroyed by saying we'll go into a war with you, going in, and then pulling out instantly. I don't think it would have made much difference if he condemned George Bush. Frankly, it would have actually made us have less control over the way things were run in Iraq. So I would say that that would have been a really bad idea, basically, just practically. So I don't think he should have done that. Just glad he did. Last question.
Before, you said quite accurately that Blair spoke against Saddam loads of times before the actual war. There was loads of dictators around. So there was Bashar, there was Ben Ali, there was Mubarak as well. And after Saddam invaded Kuwait back in the early 90s, there were some unilateral sanctions on Iraq, something which the Iraq never had, which was a consensus to sanction them economically, which was raised early, which led to the death of over 1 million Iraqis even before the war started. My question is, if you look at all of the different acts going on at the time, and there were, to be fair, a lot of other despots at the time, what compelled this kind of support from Blair in a humanitarian interventionist idea? Before London, before the rise of WMDs, right when he invaded another nation to cost the lives of 1,000 or 1 million Iraqi children.
Well, that in itself was probably the motivation. It was a current affairs issue, and so naturally that was what prompted him to to condemn his actions strongly. With your whole thing about earlier in the 90s, obviously Tony Blair had no influence on policy at that point. So I'm not sure he did actually. I'd like to ratify that, to be honest, because I don't think that's true.
And it's unbelievable, he did a lot of things which we can't against it, but he did.
Yeah, I mean, it was because of the current affairs issue, and I think Saddam Hussein was easily one of the worst dictators at the time, if not the worst, frankly. He did really awful things, and this is Thank you, everybody. You see my name on the ballot paper in May 22nd. You know what to do.